All right, so get ready because today we're going deep into the mind of a murderer. We're going to crack open Edgar Allan Poe's The Telltale Heart. A short story so creepy it basically invented psychological suspense.
Oh, yeah. It really is a masterpiece. And, one of the things that makes it so effective is that Poe uses this unreliable narrator, which just pulls us right into this world of madness and guilt.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit. We've got a narrator who insists over and over again that he's not mad, but his actions and especially his justifications, they kind of give him away. Right from the first lines, we get this unsettling feeling. True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am, but why will you say that I am mad?
Yeah, you're totally encountering like a classic unreliable narrator right there. It's a technique that Poe, totally masters. And it makes you, the reader, complicit in this narrator's delusion. Think of it like Humbert in Lolita. You're both horrified and strangely drawn in by this twisted perspective.
And what's so interesting is that the narrator claims his disease has actually heightened his senses, not dulled them. He says he can hear all things in the heaven and in the earth, even things in hell.
It's like this heightened sensory perception, like almost like he's boasting about it. But really, it's like a classic hallmark of paranoia and obsession. It's like his senses are feeding this madness, just amplifying every little anxiety, every fear.
But it's not just any fear, it's this fixation on one specific thing. The old man's vulture eye. It's not like hate, greed, revenge that drives him to kill. It's just that eye.
The eye itself becomes this powerful symbol, like it represents everything that the narrator finds unsettling. Some critics even see it as the narrator's own guilt staring back at him, or like maybe the judgment of a higher power that he's subconsciously afraid of. It's so fascinating how this seemingly insignificant detail can become this powerful trigger for a disturbed mind.
Yeah, I can totally see that. And the way he describes it, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Ugh, that image just gets seared into your brain.
And consider this too. The narrator doesn't just snap. He meticulously plans this murder. Every night at midnight, he goes into the old man's room, slowly opens the lantern, and focuses the light on the eye. It's almost ritualistic. So I gotta ask, do you think this level of control and calculation, does that support his claim of sanity?
Well, that's a really good question. On the one hand, it's so creepy and methodical, but then he also seems to relish the act. He even chuckles to himself as he imagines the old man's fear. That doesn't exactly scream sanity to me.
That's a really good point. It does seem like there's this perverse pleasure he's deriving from this ritual. It's like a disturbing glimpse into his psyche.
Absolutely. And then we get to the actual murder. And his anxiety just goes through the roof. He starts hearing the old man's heartbeat as this hellish tattoo, getting louder and louder, almost like it's driving him to confess.
It's like his guilt is taking on this physical form, wouldn't you say? But could it also be Poe using the sound
Yeah.
to symbolize the narrator's growing paranoia? Like everyone's onto him that they can hear the heartbeat too.
Ooh, that's an interesting take. It adds another layer to the story's psychological complexity.
Exactly. Poe was a master at layering meaning, playing with our perceptions.
And speaking of perceptions, the way Poe uses sound here is brilliant. You can practically feel the narrator's own heart pounding along with that imagined heartbeat. It creates this unbearable tension.
He really was a master of Gothic literature and psychological realism. And, that brings us to a really crucial point, the moment of confession. The narrator just can't bear the weight of his guilt anymore. And that imaginary sound, the beating heart, it just pushes him over the edge.
It's so ironic, isn't it? He thinks he's been so clever, disposing of the body, acting all cool and collected with the police. But his supposedly heightened senses, the very things he bragged about, are what betray him.
Exactly. Even as he confesses, he's still clinging to this belief that he was smart and cunning. It just really highlights the depth of his delusion, how deeply entrenched he is in his own twisted reality.
It's both chilling and fascinating how Poe manages to capture that inner unraveling.
It is. Poe gives us this incredibly intimate portrait of a mind on the verge of collapse, and it forces us to confront the blurred lines between sanity and madness.
And this is just the beginning of the story. We've got this unreliable narrator, this descent into madness, and these powerful themes of guilt, perception, reality versus delusion. It's already so much to unpack.
Oh yeah, there's so much more to explore. Let's move on to the aftermath of the murder and see how Poe uses the physical act of dismembering the body to further symbolize the narrator's psychological fragmentation. So, we've kind of established that our narrator, he's far from a reliable source, and yet we're still drawn into his story. It's almost as if Poe wants us to feel complicit in this act. in this dissection of not just the body, but the narrator's sanity itself.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to put it. And it's true, even though he's clearly disturbed, there's this strange matter-of-factness in how he describes dismembering the body, as if it's just like another chore, to check off his list.
Exactly. But despite his, attempts at appearing calm and collected, the narrator's guilt starts to manifest in these little subtle ways, like when he mentions feeling pale and wishing the officers would just leave. He even develops this ringing in his ears that he initially brushes off as a headache.
Right. It's like his body is betraying him, revealing the truth that he's so desperately trying to hide.
Precisely. His heightened senses, which he was, initially bragging about, becomes his downfall. The ringing in his ears intensifies and morphs into that unmistakable sound, the old man's beating heart.
And even though the police don't seem to notice, the narrator becomes convinced that they're mocking him, that they can hear the heartbeat too.
Which again, speaks volumes about his mental state. He's trapped in this downward spiral of guilt and delusion, unable to escape the psychological torment of his actions. This is classic Poe, using psychological realism to create this atmosphere of unease and horror.
Absolutely. And there's this one detail that always sticks with me. The narrator placing his chair upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. It's almost like a subconscious compulsion, wouldn't you say?
Oh, it's such a brilliant detail, isn't it? It reveals so much about his twisted psychology. On the one hand, it shows his arrogance, this belief that he's outsmarted everyone. But on the other hand, it highlights this subconscious connection to the crime scene, this inability to truly separate himself from the act.
He's practically daring fate, daring his guilt to expose him.
And that's exactly what happens. As that imagined heartbeat gets louder and louder, the narrator's carefully constructed facade just crumbles, leading to his dramatic confession.
That final outburst. "Villains!" I shrieked. "Dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, here." It is the beating of his hideous heart. It's both terrifying and tragic.
It's the culmination of his psychological unraveling, the moment where guilt and madness completely consume him. It's a powerful reminder of the destructive nature of guilt and the fine line between sanity and madness.
So much happens in such a short story. We've got this chilling exploration of madness, the themes of guilt and perception, the blurring of reality and delusion. What do you think Poe wants us to take away from The Telltale Heart?
That's a great question. The Telltale Heart is this complex and multi-layered work that, as we've seen, continues to fascinate and disturb readers. I think one of the key takeaways is this exploration of the dark side of human psychology. Poe forces us to confront the potential for darkness that exists within all of us.
Right, and the fact that it's told from the perspective of an unreliable narrator, it just makes it all the more unsettling. We're constantly questioning what's real, what's imagined, and what it all says about the human condition.
Exactly. We're forced to piece together the truth ourselves, to constantly question the narrator's motives and sanity. It's a story that stays with you long after you finish reading it, prompting you to examine your own perceptions of reality and the nature of truth.
And on that note, I think it's time to shift gears a little bit. We've talked a lot about the psychological aspects of the story, but The Telltale Heart also raises some important questions about justice and punishment. So let's dive into that. So we had this narrator, and he commits this truly horrific act. But he's also clearly struggling with, his sanity. It makes you wonder, is he truly responsible for his actions? Where do we draw the line between madness and accountability?
That's the question, isn't it? It's a question that's been debated forever by legal scholars and philosophers. And Poe, he doesn't give us any easy answers. He presents the narrator's madness not as a simple excuse, but as this complicating factor that forces us to grapple with, the complexities of human behavior.
I mean, he clearly planned and executed the murder. But his mental state is so unstable, it's hard to say where responsibility begins and ends.
Exactly. And that ambiguity is part of what makes The Telltale Heart so compelling and so unsettling. It challenges us to think critically about justice and punishment, to consider those gray areas where the lines aren't so clear-cut.
Right. And then there's that lingering question. If the narrator hadn't confessed, would anyone have ever suspected him?
That's the chilling thought Poe leaves us with, isn't it? The idea that sometimes the most monstrous acts go unpunished, that the true horror lies not just in the physical violence, but in the psychological torment that follows, and maybe in the possibility that no one will ever know the truth.
It's almost like a commentary on the unseen darkness that can exist within seemingly ordinary people.
Precisely. And that makes The Telltale Heart more than just a chilling horror story. It's a cautionary tale about the fragility of the human psyche, the deceptive nature of appearances, and the enduring power of guilt and conscience.
It's a story that, as we've seen, operates on so many levels. We've got the unreliable narrator, the descent into madness, the exploration of guilt and perception, and these really thought-provoking questions about justice and punishment.
It's a testament to Poe's genius, that a story written over 150 years ago can still resonate so deeply with modern readers. He was a master of exploring the dark side of human nature. And The Telltale Heart remains one of the most powerful and enduring examples of that exploration.
Well said. I think we've successfully unpacked The Telltale Heart, or at least scratched the surface of this literary masterpiece.
There's always more to discover with Poe. Every reading reveals something new, some hidden depth that you might have missed before.
Absolutely. So to our listeners, if you haven't already, I highly recommend checking out The Telltale Heart. And as you go about your day, maybe listen a little closer to the sounds around you. You never know what telltale hearts might be beating beneath the surface.